You think taxes come out of your salary, but the biggest tax you pay isn't on your paycheck. It's inflation, and most people don't even notice it. Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing 10% of your savings vanished overnight. No notification, no bill, no vote. You'd call it theft. But when it happens slowly, quietly over years, we call it inflation, and governments around the world rely on that difference. This matters right now because inflation isn't a temporary accident anymore. It's not a glitch. It's not just supply chains or greedy companies. It's a system, a very old one, and you're paying for it every single day, whether you notice or not. Let me tell you a story. In 2020, governments faced a problem they've been avoiding for decades. Debt levels were already extreme, budgets were fragile, and then the world shut down. Tax revenue collapsed, spending exploded, and raising taxes the normal way was politically radioactive. So they chose the option that doesn't require permission. They printed, not always physically, mostly digitally. But the effect is the same. New money enters the system, the supply of currency increases, and each existing unit quietly loses a little value. No press conference announces it as a tax. But economically, that's exactly what it is. To understand how this works, forget charts for a moment. Think about pizza. If a town has 10 pizzas and 10 people, everyone gets one slice. Now imagine the government prints 10 more claim tickets for pizza, but doesn't bake new pizzas. Suddenly there are 20 claims on 10 pizzas. Prices go up, not because pizza became better, but because money became worse. That's inflation in its simplest form. Now here's the part most people miss. Inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. When new money is created, it doesn't fall from the sky. It enters at specific points. Governments spend it, banks lend it. Large institutions receive it first. They buy assets before prices adjust. Stocks, real estate, bonds. By the time the money reaches wages and everyday consumers, prices have already risen. This is called the Cantillon Effect. It's not a conspiracy, it's basic sequencing. Early receivers win, late receivers lose. If you're paid a salary, if you save in cash, if your income adjusts slowly, you're last in line. That's why inflation feels like a tax on people who didn't vote for it. Now let's look at the math. Governments don't advertise. Say a country owes $1 trillion. If inflation runs at 5%, the real value of that debt shrinks by 5% per year. Same number. Less purchasing power. From the government's perspective, inflation is a debt haircut that no creditor gets to negotiate. Bondholders lose quietly. Savers lose quietly. Wage earners lose quietly. And the government, it pays back yesterday's debt with today's cheaper money. This is why moderate inflation is officially described as healthy, not because it helps you, because it helps the balance sheet. Publicly, inflation is framed as a temporary inconvenience, a side effect. A storm will wait out. Privately, it's one of the most reliable tools governments have ever used. History is full of examples. In ancient Rome, silver coins were gradually diluted with cheaper metals. Same coin, less silver. The result? Rising prices, public confusion, and a government able to fund itself longer than it otherwise could. Fast forward to the 20th century. After World War II, many countries emerged with massive debts. Instead of defaulting, they inflated. In the United States, inflation averaged over 4% for decades after the war. Debt to GDP fell, not because the debt disappeared, but because the currency shrank around it. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Inflation isn't just about money printing, it's also about incentives. Politicians are rewarded for spending now and paying later. Central banks are rewarded for preventing short-term pain, even if it causes long-term erosion. And voters tend to punish visible taxes more than invisible ones. Raise income tax by 5% and people revolt. Lose 5% of purchasing power over a year, and most people blame the economy. Same outcome, very different reaction. That's why inflation is politically efficient. It's vague, it's complex, and it spreads responsibility so thin that no single actor takes the blame. Now let's talk about what inflation actually does to your life. It doesn't just make things more expensive. It changes behavior. When money loses value over time, saving becomes irrational. Spending becomes urgent. Debt becomes attractive. Why save cash that shrinks every year? Why not borrow cheap money and pay it back later with weaker currency? This pushes people toward riskier assets. Speculation increases. Asset bubbles form. Housing becomes unaffordable not because houses got better, but because money got cheaper. At the same time, wages rarely keep up. Inflation is reported as an average. Your personal inflation rate is usually higher. You can't substitute rent. You can't substitute health care. You can't substitute food. So while official numbers might say inflation is cooling, your expenses keep rising. This gap is where frustration lives. Now contrast this with the public messaging. You're told inflation is temporary or necessary or under control. You're told it protects jobs, stabilizes markets, prevents worse outcomes. Sometimes that's partially true, but notice what's missing from the conversation. No one asks who pays, because the answer is uncomfortable. Inflation rewards borrowers and punishes savers. It helps governments and hurts people who rely on fixed incomes. It quietly redistributes wealth without a single law being passed. And once inflation expectations set in, they're hard to reverse. People demand higher wages. Companies raise prices preemptively. Central banks face a dilemma: raise rates and cause pain now, or tolerate inflation and erode trust slowly. Either way, someone loses. Zoom out further and the long-term risks become clearer. When people stop trusting money, they change how they interact with society. They speculate instead of invest. They consume instead of plan. They focus on short-term survival instead of long-term stability. This isn't theoretical. We've seen it in countries where inflation ran too hot for too long. First comes denial, then normalization, then adaptation. And by the time trust breaks, rebuilding it takes generations. Here's the irony. Inflation is often justified as a way to keep the system stable, but over time it can make the system more fragile. Debt piles up because cheap money encourages borrowing. Markets become dependent on stimulus, and any attempt to stop inflation risks triggering collapse. So governments walk a tightrope. Print too little, and the system stalls. Print too much, and the currency dissolves. Now ask yourself this: if inflation were truly just a natural force, why do policymakers work so hard to manage it? Why target specific percentages? Why intervene aggressively when it falls too low? Because inflation isn't weather, it's architecture, and you live inside it. So the next time prices rise and headlines tell you it's temporary, remember this: no one sent you a tax bill, no one asked for your consent, but your purchasing power paid anyway. And the real question isn't whether inflation will continue. It's this: how much of your future is being quietly spent before you ever get to use it